What's up, everyone? So I got a really great question on my IG question series. Someone asked, is it better to squat barefoot or in shoes designed for it? So I think this really is a good chance to start this conversation about appropriate footwear for specific tasks. So I think a better approach to choosing footwear is to approach it the same way we think about something like a sport-specific cleat, or even more specifically, a skate. So these two things, the cleat and the skate, we use these for very specific sports, right? A cleat is used in turf-related sports, a hockey skate obviously used on the ice. Now, when we do these two specific sports, we have a specific footwear for those sports. And these ones are even a little bit more obvious than some of the other things that we're going to talk about. So when we play hockey, obviously we put a skate on, we do the sport on the ice, then we take that skate off and we put on whatever footwear afterward. With a cleat, it's the same thing. You know, we may walk from a dressing room onto a field. Once we're done, that footwear comes off and we put something else on. Where things get muddled is in the gym. So choosing the right footwear for the activity that you're doing in the gym itself. And I think what we run into a lot of the time is people want a piece of footwear that you can do everything in. And that does exist to a certain extent. But the mistake a lot of people make is they'll use a sport-specific shoe to do something else that isn't specific to that sport. And the most common example you see when you walk around a gym is using something like a running shoe with a soft sole, an elevated heel, not a lot of structure to it, to do things like squatting and deadlifting. Now, the problem with this is when we're trying to generate a lot of force into the ground with an external load like a barbell, we lose a lot of that force generation in the shoe itself. I always use the example of running on concrete or running on sand. When we run on sand, it's a lot slower. We're not able to generate as much force because our foot is moving on the surface. Versus when we run on concrete, there's a much more immediate response when you generate force because the ground is not moving. We can think about that same concept when we talk about footwear. With a shoe like this that has a soft sole, if I'm trying to generate force, especially through the heel of the shoe, I'm going to lose a lot of that force in the footwear itself rather than creating force directly into the ground and translating into whatever movement I'm trying to do, like a squat. The other thing with this piece of footwear is that it doesn't have a lot of lateral stability. So if we lose any sense of, central point of focus with our balance, and that footwear starts to move side to side in that the foam is compressing, this isn't a great scenario for our ankle, knee, and hip to actually learn how to become more stable when the ground is always moving. So, getting away from wearing this type of footwear in the gym and moving to something more specific to this question of whether we're using bare feet or a specific shoe designed for the gym. So let's use the squat as an example first. Using something like a Olympic lifting shoe or a weightlifting shoe with an elevated heel, this is going to provide us a really solid base of support to create force by driving into, like this shoe, for example, is made with a plastic heel that has zero give. You can even change the insole in this shoe to something that is thinner or more rigid to provide even more direct feedback when you're creating force through the ground. So the second part of this is the elevated heel itself, in the sense that when we are doing something like a squat, if we're trying to create a more upright torso angle, we may use an elevated heel to provide more ankle range, more hip range to stay in a more upright position and translate more force directly into the ground rather than having some translation either into the toe or into the hip. For most people, a heel is going to be beneficial. You're going to see an improvement in that squat technique. If we're using something that is dramatically high, or even using a plate under the shoe itself, Ideally, that is just a short-term solution. We want to do things like work on our mobility, work on our balance, work on our stability so that our technique improves, and then we can gradually reduce that angle. But when we're doing a sport-specific movement, like for me, for example, the Olympic lifts, this shoe is designed for that sport specifically. So when I'm doing Olympic lifts, I'm always going to be wearing this shoe. There's really no benefit to me wearing a low drop shoe while doing the Olympic lifts, since when I'm actually competing in the sport, I'm always going to be wearing the shoe, right? An example of that might be like running on turf with a running shoe to do a sport like lacrosse or football, when in the game itself, I'm actually going to be wearing the cleat every time. So why practice with a shoe with no studs when I'm always going to be competing with a shoe with studs? So the same kind of concept. If I'm going to be squatting, especially if I'm competing in powerlifting or Olympic lifting, and this shoe is an advantage, then I want to train in this shoe when I'm doing those lifts specifically. Moving away from an elevated heel, a next great option is, as I mentioned, like a low drop shoe, something that has a very flat sole. So this is advantageous because it has a more responsive bottom like this elevated heel does. It is much more responsive than this foam heel, and it gives us that direct force into the ground. Now, and a good example of this, and this has been a bit of a resurgence in the footwear industry, is companies coming out with a minimalist shoe. And there's probably now a half dozen companies that are coming out with a really high quality shoe. So the one that I have is a Vivo Barefoot. Basically what it is a very, very thin sole, like almost nothing. There is no insert in this shoe, so it's completely flat, very light, extremely flexible. And the idea is that this is going to be as close to the movement of our naked foot as possible. It's not going to inhibit our foot from moving in all directions, and it's not going to provide this kind of cushy feel that we get in like a running shoe, for that example. So a Vivo Barefoot shoe is awesome when we're doing basically all other movements in the gym that don't require sport-specific footwear like the Olympic lifting shoe. So wearing something like this is going to be great for basically everything else. So if we're doing things like walking lunges, if we're doing deadlifts, if we're doing even overhead pressing and standing on our feet and we're trying to generate force from the ground up, this is a great piece of footwear to be wearing that's actually going to promote your foot health, which is super important, right? We look at these other sport-specific shoes that are very narrow, that create a sort of crushed forefoot position. Is not a great feel, right? This is going to allow that foot to move around as much as it needs to. So when we think about something specific now, like the deadlift, using a zero drop piece of footwear where we're right on the ground, when we're trying to generate force through our feet, there is no, using that analogy again, there's no sand below our foot. We're directly on concrete, meaning any force that we create into the ground is going to be that automatic response, and that's going to translate into the thing that we're doing, in this example, the deadlift. So Vivo Barefoot is a great option, all around kind of training shoe when we're doing specific movements in the gym, other than sport-specific movements that require that elevated heel. Now, a really common secondary footwear option that a lot of people choose, and you see a lot in the powerlifting community, is a Converse Chuck Taylor. So, you can see the difference between these two shoes are very complementary, right? They're both low profile. They have a fairly smaller, shallow heel and a flat shoe position. So between the two of these, these are fairly interchangeable. Now, my personal issue with the Converse is when you look at the forefoot itself, you can see how much more narrow that forefoot of the Converse is versus that Vivo Barefoot, right? So if you have a wider forefoot, which most of us should if we have a healthy foot, this still provides quite a bit of tension in the forefoot itself. So this may not be the best option for all people, but it's also a very accessible shoe. Like in Canada, this thing costs $80, whereas the Vivo Barefoot is closer to $200. So accessibility with the Converse, right? That's always a great option. The sole is fairly solid for the most part. There is a little bit of cushion in it, but generally speaking, there's going to be way more direct translation of force in this shoe, again, versus the running shoe in the gym. Now, the next step, I would say, for people who are doing a little bit of everything in the gym, this is kind of where people get caught, right? They want a piece of footwear that's going to cover all their bases. And this has kind of been tackled a little bit by the CrossFit community, because a lot of their workouts require multiple movements in one series that are a bit all over the place. So, if we look at certain examples that have, deadlifting, chin-ups, and running in one full series, well, what footwear do you wear for that? So the CrossFit community has come up with these sort of cross-trainer shoes, or modern cross-trainer shoes, that allow us to do different movements within one series and not having to flip footwear on and off all the time. So something like a Metcon or a Reebok Nano, these are really good examples of a shoe that kind of combines a little bit of each of these. So for this shoe, for example, has a fairly flat footbed. It has pretty responsive a heel, right? There's not a ton of cushion in here, but there is enough that if we were going to squat in these, it would be a pretty good option. If we were going to run in these, it would be a pretty good option. Like, they're pretty flexible. They have enough cushion that if we're hitting the ground a lot, it's not going to create, force up the leg too much. And if we're doing, other general movements in the gym, this is a pretty good all-around shoe for stuff like that. So if you're looking to purchase one piece of footwear to cover all of your training options in the gym, looking at something like a Metcon or a Nano or even like the No Bulls, those are really great all-around shoe options that you can basically do anything in. Like I mentioned, when we're getting into more sport-specific things, we may want to start to look at getting a heel elevated shoe if we're, competing in squatting or things like that nature, or if you really feel like you could benefit from the added mobility, range of motion that you get from having that elevated heel. I think another point to bring up is wearing footwear for a specific sport and then switching to something else. So really, like the examples we gave with the hockey skate and the cleat, those ones are a bit more obvious because they come off as soon as that sport is done. Something different than that is maybe in like a basketball scenario where on the court we're wearing a basketball shoe, it's tied extremely tight, the foot is kind of squished in place so it doesn't move around when we're changing direction. But the challenge is a basketball shoe is also quite stylish and you can wear that basically anywhere. So what we see is basketball players leaving the court, putting on either the same shoe or another pair of shoes, wearing them basically the same way, and they're doing that all day long. So their foot never gets a break. It's never out of that sport-specific shoe because it kind of translates into both worlds. I think what the best option is to do is to find a secondary footwear style for you when you leave the court. So as much as it is not as stylish as a Jordan 3, wearing a Vivo barefoot, something that's going to let your foot move and breathe, just giving your foot the opportunity to recover from that sport itself is going to help with the overall foot health. Now, there's a whole other argument about whether that actually even matters or not, but just in my opinion, giving your foot a bit of a break from a sport-specific footwear to do other things, I think is always a good option, and trying to reserve specific footwear for that specific sport when you're actually doing it. I hope all this information about footwear is helpful. If you have any more questions about this, I love talking about footwear and I'd love to tackle this in even more detail. So thank you guys so much for checking this out and listening. Please like, subscribe, and share if you enjoyed this, and we'll be back with more information later. Have a great day.